The army was a machine built on necessity. By 1942, that machine was starving for men. George D. Wilson was a young man who wore glasses. He had been rejected by both the Marines and the Navy. Now he found himself swept into the Great Mobilization. In September 1942, he was drafted. He passed his initial screenings at Fort Custer. He entered a system designed to strip away the civilian. This system was meant to impose the soldier in the shortest possible time. The training was a relentless, grinding process. It began with a 7-week basic infantry course. This was a brutal introduction to discipline and exhaustion. It took place in the Louisiana swamps. There, men learned how to move, shoot, and endure. For college men like Wilson, the pressure quickly intensified. They faced a 7-week crash course. This was followed immediately by infantry school at Fort Benning. The pace was desperate, reflecting the catastrophic need for junior leaders. On May 8, 1943, Wilson was commissioned as second lieutenant. He was transformed into one of the 90-day wonders. This title acknowledged their achievement, but also their profound lack of real-world combat experience. The army had manufactured an officer. The battlefield would now prove whether he was a leader. The steep learning curve was immediately apparent. Training had been intense, but it could not replicate the chaos of war. The psychological toll, the fear, and the brutal realities were often glossed over. These junior officers were forced to rely on instinct and luck. The D-Day landings in June 1944 created an immediate, massive demand for replacements. These freshly minted lieutenants were sucked into the combat pipeline. Wilson's journey to the front began with a North Atlantic crossing in April 1944. He joined a convoy of approximately 100 ships. This vast fleet was a vulnerable target, sailing through waters haunted by German U-boats. The voyage was a baptism by the elements. It was a foretaste of the war's indifference to human comfort. A tremendous storm descended upon the convoy. It turned the ocean into a mountainous chaos. The ships pitched, rolled, and vibrated violently. Men reeled into bouts of seasickness. Their stomachs churned against the constant, nerve-wracking threat of submarine alerts. By the end of June 1944, the convoy delivered its cargo of replacements to the coast of France. Wilson landed on Utah Beach. He waded ashore in chest-deep, frigid water. The sand was not the clean, firm ground of training exercises. It was a churned landscape of ruin. The air was thick with the pervasive stench of death. It was a sickening mix of pulverized earth, burnt fuel, and rotting flesh. The hot July sun amplified this horror. Burned-out vehicles lay blasted along the dunes. Wilson was confronted with the immediate visceral devastation of war. The preparatory phase was over. On July 12, 1944, he was assigned to the 22nd Infantry Regiment. His introduction to the reality of command came swiftly. He met with Colonel Buck Lanham. Lanham was a man of stark, unforgiving clarity. He delivered a warning that cut through any lingering romantic notions of glory. Casualties were astronomically high, the colonel stated. Officers were required to lead from the absolute front. Survival, Lanham made clear, was not guaranteed. It was merely the prerequisite for promotion. Wilson was assigned to E Company, reporting to Captain Holcomb. He was introduced to men who had already tasted the fight. These included fellow officer Lieutenant Pizarnik. He also met experienced non-coms like Sergeant Chick Reed and Assistant Platoon Sergeant Otha Anders. Wilson was now a part of the line. He faced the brutal grind of the hedgerow country. There, every yard would be paid for in blood. The hedgerow country of Normandy was not merely a battleground, it was a tactical labyrinth that shredded Allied momentum and morale. The ancient dense bocage provided the Germans with a natural, nearly impregnable fortress. These embankments were often over 2 feet thick. They were reinforced with tangled root systems. Every field became a fortified position. Daily gains were measured in mere hundreds of yards, paid for in blood. Colonel Lanham's stark warning about casualties was realized immediately. The fighting was a brutal, close-quarters grind. It demanded specialized tactics. This included desperately fitting tanks with steel, scythe-like bumpers. These bumpers were needed to tear through the defenses. This stalemate demanded a decisive, overwhelming blow. It was called the Saint-Lô Breakthrough Offensive. The initial assault was marred by catastrophe. The massive carpet-bombing operation was tragically miscalculated. It was intended to pulverize German lines. Instead, hundreds of bombers dropped ordnance onto their own positions. This killed over 800 American men. It caused delays that amplified the psychological strain. When the actual attack began on July 26, the troops advanced. They moved under a cloud of grim certainty. Mistakes and death were inevitable. Wilson's advance near Carrington was characterized by a sensory overload of terror. The pervasive stench of death was overwhelming. It was a sickening combination of rot and explosives. When the first shelling began, it was a physical assault. Wilson experienced the terrifying impact firsthand. The ground around him erupted as his foxhole collapsed. The sheer percussion of the blast left his ears ringing and his body disoriented. He saw the physical evidence of the war's chaos lining the route. Burned-out vehicles and blasted equipment were grim monuments to the impersonal violence of artillery. The chaos culminated in St. Gilles, a small hamlet. It became the stage for Wilson's forced initiation into lethal personal combat. His unit was caught in a close-quarters battle. It was fought between a Sherman tank and a concealed German Mark IV. When the German tank was disabled, its commander, a sergeant, scrambled out. Instead of surrendering, the man charged Wilson. He was driven by animal instinct, moving like a cornered animal. Wilson was caught completely unprepared. He had only 8 rounds in his M1 rifle. In that moment of extreme personal peril, the war ceased to be a strategic concept. It became a primal struggle for survival. Wilson narrowly avoided being killed by a man whose world had just been incinerated. This experience demanded the formation of a protective shield. It was a pragmatic shift that prioritized the immediate task over emotional engagement. Rigid adherence to training proved insufficient for survival. Survival hinged solely on instinct and adaptability. The ultimate brutal awakening arrived at Villebourdon Ridge. The advance, intended as routine, dissolved into a massacre. German forces, perfectly positioned, unleashed devastating fire. Their superior 88mm artillery pieces easily sliced through the armor of the American Shermans. They demolished 9 of 17 tanks. The attack nearly wiped out the infantry. The chaos was compounded by a fatal miscommunication. Red smoke signals resulted in Allied artillery barraging their own troops. This caused significant casualties and confusion. A new battalion commander was unfamiliar with the terrain or the enemy's strength. He led a relieving battalion directly into a prepared German kill zone. The influx of inexperienced recruits, coupled with these tactical blunders, proved disastrous. Wilson's platoon was decimated, reduced to only 6 of 40 men. His company dwindled to 27 out of an original 168. The Saint-Lô breakthrough was achieved at a catastrophic human cost. It confirmed Colonel Lanham's warning. It debunked any lingering myth of a clean, heroic war. Survival was the only measure of success. The catastrophic success of the Saint-Lô breakthrough opened the floodgates to France. The destruction of German armies in the Falaise Gap followed. The brutal grind of the hedgerows gave way to the exhilarating pace of the chase. To maintain momentum, the Allies desperately needed to cross the Seine River. German anti-aircraft fire thwarted the initial pontoon bridge attempts. In a moment of crucial ingenuity, a French naval captain provided the solution. He suggested using a moored ship to slow the current. This allowed engineers to construct a vital pontoon bridge. It secured the gateway into the heart of France. This rapid advance culminated in the liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944. The psychological victory was profound. It was a sudden, surreal shift from the blood-soaked earth of Normandy. The city erupted in joy. Wilson's unit entered Paris amidst crowds so ecstatic they bordered on hysteria. People were tossing flowers, candy, and wine. Drunken tank drivers navigated the streets. They were celebrating with an uninhibited joy. This stood in stark contrast to the mud, exhaustion, and fear that had defined the preceding months. But the euphoria was fleeting. It was quickly replaced by the grim realities of pursuit. The German retreat was a race for territory. It demanded 50 to 60 miles of advance per day. This speed, however, fostered lax discipline. When soldiers wandered off for wine and women, they encountered Germans. This led to a small arms fight. It forced a swift, deadly reassessment of security protocols. The closer the advance got to Germany, the tighter the civilian population's faces grew. Smiles vanished, replaced by anxiety. They realized the war was not over, but merely moving through them. The roads themselves were littered with wrecked wagons. They were filled with the detritus of a collapsing army. Near the German border, the landscape revealed the brutal asymmetry of modern conflict. Wilson's unit witnessed the devastation of a horse-drawn German regiment. It was caught in an overwhelming aerial and artillery attack. This was a stark symbol of outdated warfare being annihilated by technological superiority. Yet, the enemy still held lethal surprises. A lieutenant colonel ordered Wilson's platoon into an open sugar beet field. They were immediately confronted by the pervasive terror of the Bouncing Betty anti-personnel mine. Its two-stage explosion, a small pop followed by the lethal blast, churned the guts of every man. The pursuit ended abruptly with the sighting of the first pillbox of the Siegfried Line. This was not the hedgerow country. This was a wall. The fortification had 8-foot-thick cement walls. Its roofs were 10 to 12 feet thick. This signaled the end of the chase. It meant the imminent start of a new grinding phase. Colonel Buck Lanham, however, saw the Siegfried Line not as an obstacle but as a challenge. He was driven by an aggressive belief in swift, decisive attacks. Lanham correctly identified the pillbox's vulnerability from the rear. Lieutenant Colonel Teague led the 3rd Battalion in the initial successful breach on September 12th. They were the first to see and penetrate the German border. They drove a wedge into the heart of the defences. This achievement, which could have been the prelude to a rapid advance to the Rhine, was immediately strangled by logistics. Critical supply shortages halted the advance. Specifically, gasoline and ammunition were missing. Division headquarters' caution, coupled with rumours of preferential supply to Patton's Third Army, meant the opportunity was lost. The chance for rapid exploitation vanished. The regiment stalled. They endured over a week in exposed defensive positions. This was followed by another week of stasis. They were unable to receive hot food for more than a month. The failure to exploit the initial breach in September 1944 was a major strategic error. It unnecessarily prolonged the war. Troops were forced to retake the same ground months later at immense human cost. During this exposed, static period, German artillery became a daily terror. Wilson and his comrades had a grandstand seat view of the naked power of artillery. This happened when another battalion was caught in a sudden ambush by Nebelwerfers. These were the dreaded screaming meanies. The nerve-shattering, shrill screech of the descending rockets sent men scattering. This resulted in heavy casualties. It illustrated the psychological toll that led to jitters and breakdowns among the soldiers. The front line demanded constant intelligence. This transformed the nature of combat into brutal, high-stakes patrols. The rugged terrain of the Hürtgen Forest amplified the danger. It was dense with ravines and steep slopes. But the fundamental change was the introduction of widespread anti-personnel mines. Planted inches below the soil, these were vicious, deadly devices. They instilled a pervasive fear that limited movement. They churned soldiers' guts. A patrol was no longer a reconnaissance mission. It was a desperate gamble against unseen death. Its only real defense was luck. The stakes were raised when Colonel Walker, the battalion commander, demanded prisoners for intelligence. This shifted the focus to aggressive combat patrols with the specific objective of capture. This order was met with shock and resistance. During one briefing in total darkness, men openly questioned the directive and refused to go. They were paralyzed by the fear of mines. The danger was not theoretical. One 6-man patrol returned with 5 men having lost limbs and 1 killed. This demonstrated that even cautious movement could lead to horrific injuries. Wilson quickly learned that rigid adherence to unreliable maps was suicidal. Constant movement and a staggering line formation were the only chances for survival. Every step was a moral compromise between fear and duty against an enemy of hidden positions and booby traps. The Hürtgen Forest campaign was a strategic black hole. It was a place where American lives were traded for yards of shell-splintered earth. It was a battle that arguably should never have been fought. The decision to commit forces to this dense, unforgiving terrain was driven by fear. Leaders feared the Germans would use the forest as a base for counter-offensives. Worse, they feared the Germans would flood the Ruhr dams. What resulted was a meat grinder. Every tactical advantage belonged to the enemy. German bunkers were almost immune to Allied artillery. The maze of steep hills, rough ridges, and deep ravines neutralized American air and fire superiority. The dense forest itself became a weapon. The dreary rain and snow of the approaching winter set in. The roller coaster terrain became miserably challenging. The cold seeped into the men. They slept on rough ground in their woolen clothes. They were fighting a constant, losing battle against the chill. But the most terrifying environmental factor was the tree burst. German artillery shells exploded in the dense canopy overhead. They spread shrapnel downwards like rain. It was a continuous, infinitely lethal shower of steel. Lieutenant Wilson experienced this firsthand. One blast knocked him unconscious. It left him disoriented and temporarily deafened. This was a brutal lesson in the unique lethality of the Hürtgen. Amidst this relentless attrition, Wilson was abruptly thrust back into the line. He had been in the relative safety of Battalion Intelligence, or S2. He had just finished compiling valuable intelligence. This included a detailed map based on the interrogation of a Polish prisoner. He even gleaned insights into German morale from a staunch Hitler fanatic corporal. But successive officer casualties decimated F Company. Wilson, despite feeling profoundly unprepared, was ordered to take command. The situation demanded immediate radical adaptation. Overwhelming enemy fire pinned down platoons advancing in wide, thin lines. Wilson suggested a crucial change to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Keenan, the new battalion commander. He advised shifting the attack plan to a column of platoons. Keenan adopted the suggestion. This demonstrated the necessity of adaptable, on-the-ground leadership. Colonel Keenan became the lodestar for the exhausted troops. The atmosphere was one of profound hopelessness. Bullets whipped through the air, clipping twigs and tugging at clothes. Yet Keenan maintained a calm, resolute presence. He countered despair with absolute certainty. When Wilson reported the dire situation, Keenan's response was firm. He said, "Wilson, ammo is on the way over now." He added, "I know what you're up against, and I know you can and will continue to advance and take that line of defense." This positive thinking was critical, but it could not stop the human breaking point. The psychological toll manifested in raw, desperate ways. The medical staff was decimated. Stretcher bearers were dropping from exhaustion. The allure of a wound just bad enough to send them to the hospital was a dangerous temptation. Wilson was forced to confront two new radiomen who attempted to fake battle fatigue. One was shaking violently and crying. He begged to be sent to the rear, calling himself a dirty, no-good, yellow, Jewish SOB in his breakdown. Wilson, initially frustrated, used a harsh, pragmatic approach to force compliance. He stated, "You're trying to play me for an idiot, and I've had it with you." He then used a football analogy to re-engage the soldier. This demonstrated the thin, jagged line between discipline and empathy required to keep men functioning in hell. The most catastrophic losses of the campaign were the result of a single fatal error of bureaucracy and map reading. On the night of November 30th, F Company secured Groschau with surprising ease. It was a brief moment of relief, but around midnight, Wilson's forward observer, Lieutenant Caldwell, identified a German marching column. It was moving into position on a nearby hill. Wilson's heated protests and urgent requests for artillery fire were summarily denied by headquarters. Headquarters was relying on an armoured infantry captain's erroneous map reading. The captain insisted the hill was held by Americans. The denial of crucial artillery support proved catastrophic. The following morning, December 1st, the main attack commenced across an open, ploughed field. As the American troops advanced, the sky fell in. They were met immediately by overwhelming, zeroed-in German fire. This included artillery, mortar, machine gun, and tank fire. The advance turned into a brutal slaughter. Men were forced to dive for cover in shell holes as the area was relentlessly pounded. Wilson, trapped with his radioman in a shell hole, endured a terrifying ordeal. His radioman succumbed to the strain, crying and begging to be sent back. Wilson refused, though his own nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The lack of medics and the relentless fire cut down men like a bloody scythe. In 2 days, the costly advance gained only about 800 yards, The price, Wilson knew, was paid directly for the 5th Armoured Infantry captain's inability to read a map. It was also paid for headquarters' refusal to trust the eyes on the ground. F Company was reduced to just 12 men, including Wilson and Sergeant Bert Smith. The arrival of a relief company offered no solace. They displayed a shocking lack of discipline. Enlisted men were addressing officers by their first names. The Hürtgen Forest was an 18-day testament to attrition. It was a battle where flawed strategy and bureaucratic inertia led to preventable catastrophic losses. George Wilson was left as the sole officer of a decimated company. He was forever questioning the true cost of war. The transfer to Luxembourg, intended as a brief respite in a quiet sector, proved to be a grim joke played by fate. Within days, the German offensive erupted. This was the Battle of the Bulge. It plunged the depleted American forces into chaos. This chaos was amplified tenfold by the onset of a historically savage winter. The front line became an endurance test against the elements as much as the enemy. Temperatures plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. The American soldiers were tragically unprepared. They fought and slept in freezing foxholes dug from fresh snow. They were equipped with nothing more than a wool beanie and finger gloves. They had a single pair of cotton socks and overshoes on leather boots. The misery was absolute. Trench foot became a near epidemic. It was a constant threat born from the inability to change socks or remove shoes for weeks. Survival devolved into a series of small, desperate rituals. Men carried canteens under coats to prevent water from freezing. They melted ice between their legs for hydration. They meticulously guarded their weapons from the ubiquitous corrosive snow. The struggle was not heroic. It was the sheer, bone-deep effort of putting one foot in front of the other. They fought the cold, day after relentless day. The German attack was formidable. It involved at least a full battalion with heavy tank support, aimed at key positions like Rodenhof. The sound of the enemy's screaming memes was a piercingly shrill, eerie screech. These rocket launchers were larger than 155mm shells. The sound ripped through the cold air and shredded nerves. Yet, amidst the terror there was deliverance. The Allied artillery responded with powerful salvos of 16 rounds per battery. It was a sound the beleaguered troops described as sweet music. It was a Hürtgen hell inflicted back upon the enemy. The chaos of the Bulge exposed the vulnerability of the influx of poorly trained replacements. The dangers came not only from the enemy but from within. In one farmhouse kitchen, a recruit accidentally detonated a fragmentation rifle grenade. The safety pin was still attached. This wounded 17 men, including the company clerk, Francis Thiethels. This high-stress environment demanded experienced leadership. Officers like Lieutenant Gesner proved vital. He taught desperate survival tricks. One trick was using TNT to blast a quick foxhole in the frozen ground. He noted pragmatically that a little extra noise is not too important when saving a life. A brief, alienating break came when Lieutenant Colonel Kennan insisted Wilson take R&R in Paris. After months steeped in mud, filth, and the stench of death, the City of Light felt profoundly unreal. The hysterical, emotional tidal wave of the liberation was gone. It was replaced by a war-weary populace and an economy that felt transactional. Wilson, still caked in the experience of the front, felt like an interloper. This disconnect crystallized at the American Officers Club. He was confronted over strict uniform protocols by rear echelon officers. These men were enjoying comfort and excess. He bristled with bitterness. He imagined the fantasy of sending these comfortable men to endure K-rations on the front lines. His loneliness was amplified by the impersonal nature of the city. This culminated in a misadventure on the subway. He became lost and narrowly avoided missing his convoy back to the war. The respite was over quickly. By late January 1945, the 4th Division was rolling north. They were transferred to Patton's Third Army. The journey back through the Ardennes was a grim tour of overwhelming destruction. Bastogne was utterly leveled. Everything, Wilson noted, except for a few skeletal sidewalls, was gone. The air was thick with the stench of burnt mattresses. St. Vith, viewed from the southern heights, was a nightmarish, surrealistic painting of bomb craters. This immense devastation was a testament to the appalling cost of holding the line. The strategic push demanded they penetrate the Siegfried Line again. This meant engaging in repeated, costly battles over ground they had already breached months before. The advance necessitated the capture of Hill 553. This hill controlled all approaches to Obermellen and Niedermellen. The preparation for the assault was grueling. On an ice-covered slope over a half-mile long, shivering and fatigued soldiers had to dig trenches. This was an ice corrugation operation. They dug into a 6-inch base of ice and compacted snow. They endured the constant, screaming threat of Nebelwerfer shells. After a failed night attack, a costly daylight assault was ordered. The tension during the advance was immense. Wilson, now a first lieutenant, had to decide the exact moment to lift the direct overhead fire from tanks and tank destroyers. He balanced the risk of friendly fire against the certainty of German counterattacks on the open slope. The Germans, terrified by the relentless blasting from the bunkers, swarmed out. This led to confused, close-quarters combat in the darkness. The assault was successful. The bunkers were captured. The quality of the fortifications meant minimal German casualties inside. They were dug 4 feet deep with 15-inch thick walls. But the victory was immediately soured by a discovery. The Germans had abandoned their bound American prisoners during the shelling. This was a grim realization of the war's ethical compromises. It was on this same day, February 8, 1945, on the road to Obermel, that Wilson's long streak of luck finally broke. He heard the whistle of an incoming shell. He instinctively threw himself flat on the frozen ground. The blast struck about 20 feet in front of him. His left foot went instantly numb. Though he first feared his toes were gone, the wound was localized. It required surgery and a walking cast. The field hospital was a stark, unheated gymnasium. It was filled with rows of stretchers. While recovering, the news that shattered him was the death of Captain Newcomb. Newcomb was his friend and sharp, unassuming commander. Newcomb had been entering a building when a shell hit the doorway. Witnesses reported he made no effort to protect himself. It was a final, devastating act of exhaustion and resignation. This loss, coupled with the realization that his prolonged 90% diet of K rations had caused severe digestive issues, marked a profound emotional turning point. He witnessed the deep psychological toll on others. He had to gently slap the face of a severely injured soldier who screamed and thrashed in his sleep. The man was reliving combat trauma. The war in Europe concluded with VE Day on May 8, 1945. It brought widespread public jubilation, dancing, and fireworks. Wilson was still processing his trauma and loss. He was reassigned to Command H Company. This was a heavy weapons unit equipped with water-cooled machine guns and 80mm mortars. His promotion, hard-won and long delayed, came under the new regimental commander, Colonel Ruggles. Colonel Lanham had been transferred. His final duties involved travel to Nuremberg. The city presented a devastating panorama of Allied bombing. Blocks of rubble and buildings were reduced to their inner floors. They appeared like giant dollhouses. He travelled in the infamous 40 and 8 boxcars. This was a stark symbol of the anticlimactic transition from combat hero to bureaucratic burden. The war was over, but the grind of demobilization continued. The immense cost of the victory was evident in the twisted rail lines. It was also seen in the ragged, dejected German soldiers straggling home. This underscored the chilling truth. The war was already uneven due to overwhelming firepower. No one, ultimately, truly wins a war defined by such grief and devastation. The surreal contrast between the front line and the rear echelon continued even after the guns fell silent. After the grinding brutality of the Hürtgen and the chaos of the Bulge, Wilson found himself in Dinkelsbühl, Germany. He was assigned to post-war occupation duty. The sudden shift from constant, visceral peril to the mundane rhythms of peace was jarring. He spent his days in an idyllic setting. He engaged in activities that felt alien to a combat veteran. He pitched horseshoes under the indifferent German sun. He fished for trout in clear streams. The quiet routine and simple pleasures were the antithesis of his recent existence. They underscored the profound psychological distance he had travelled. The journey home was not a triumphant parade but a final bureaucratic hurdle. After serving 15 months overseas, encompassing 5 major campaigns, he finally entrucked for the long journey in June 1945. His return voyage began on July 3 aboard the Liberty ship USAT × Excelsior. The North Atlantic, as always, demanded a final toll of misery. The ship was subjected to high seas. It pitched and rolled violently, ensuring many of the men succumbed to seasickness one last time. The homecoming itself was the ultimate anticlimax. At 2:00 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the veteran arrived in his hometown of Grand Ledge, Michigan. He found no one waiting. The Great War Machine, having used him up, simply spat him back out into the quiet darkness. 5 days later, on July 21, 1945, he married Florine in a church ceremony. This was followed by a large reception. The honeymoon was a short, borrowed affair. They drove his father's 1937 Hudson terraplane. It was fueled by precious gas coupons secured through a friend. It was during this fragile period of peacetime adjustment that the news broke. In July, while on leave, the world learned of the first atomic bomb dropped on Japan. The subsequent complete surrender of Japan brought forth an emotion Wilson had barely allowed himself to feel since the hedgerows. It was profound, overwhelming relief. He wept, a cleansing release from the years of terror. He now had the certainty that the war, and the endless cycle of replacements, was truly finished. On September 30, 1945, just one day after his 24th birthday, George Wilson officially became a civilian. He concluded 3 years and 11 days of service. The transition back to civilian life was as complex as the war itself. Jobs were scarce due to the immediate end of war production. Wilson declined to return to his old railroad job. He was fundamentally changed. He chose a career in sales, preferring face-to-face interactions. This was a choice he later recognized as deeply ironic. He had witnessed death and destruction that carried with it no compensation whatsoever. Yet now he was in a business that attempts to put a price on a loss. This contrast solidified his ultimate conclusion about the conflict he survived. The price paid in grief and devastation was so immeasurably expensive that no one really wins. The advent of overwhelming firepower, culminating in the nuclear age, rendered traditional military strategy obsolete. Wilson's experience taught him the terrible finality of modern conflict. He had seen gains measured in feet in the hedgerows. He had witnessed the wholesale destruction of Nuremberg. The only meaningful lesson to be drawn from the Second World War was not tactical but moral. It was the absolute prevention of future wars. If conflict must occur, he believed, it must be kept away from American shores, but his final enduring hope was simple and absolute. It was the hard-won creed of the combat veteran who had seen the worst of humanity and survived.